In January 2020, Gesina and I visited Melbourne during the bushfire season that swept through more than 17 million hectares of Australia. Watching images on the news of towering forest infernos and koalas with bandaged paws, I was struck again by the fragility of our biosphere, the thin atmospheric envelope that supports life on this earth. It's hard to comprehend the scale of this one catastrophe, and yet we're told that we're facing multiple and increasing catastrophes. So how do you stay sane in the face of climate and ecological emergency? Hello, I'm Shanti Garber and welcome to NVC Life Hacks. For the past year, I've been writing a book on a Buddhist response to the climate and ecological emergency, or CEE for short. Even though I know in much more detail the challenges we're facing, I spent less time getting gloomy or depressed during this year. So what's my secret? Well, here are my 5 tips for staying sane in the CEE. Tip number 1, acknowledge that it is an emergency. I recommend that you get informed about the situation. So you could go to trusted research sites, such as the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, listed in the description below. According to the special IPCC report in 2018, greenhouse gas emissions have already driven up average global temperatures by around 1 degree centigrade, and limiting further warming to 0.5 degrees centigrade would require roughly halving global emissions within the next decade and then cutting them back to zero by 2050. Well, this is unlikely to happen. Even under the most optimistic assumptions, current national commitments have put the world on a path to around 3 degrees centigrade of warming compared with pre-industrial times. As the Earth warms, the Arctic melts, exposing us to the far greater danger of methane, a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. On geological timescales, it's unquestionably an emergency. Our planet is changing in the geological equivalent of a twinkling of the eye, compared to similar events which have had a very traumatic effect on life on Earth. We're seeing the consequences of those changes already. To me, this sounds like a fire alarm going off. I wonder what it sounds like to you. So acknowledge to yourself and to others that it is an emergency. That doesn't mean panicking, it just means acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. Unless we acknowledge this seriousness, it's very unlikely that we'll act in ways that are proportionate to the risks involved. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that if we collectively acknowledge that something is an emergency, we can take steps that were previously unthinkable, individually and collectively. Tip number 2, become aware of when you get into horrified anxiety or find yourself just ignoring the situation. As I've been researching the book, I noticed that I tend to oscillate between these 2 states, between horrified anxiety on the one hand and just ignoring it and trying to get on with things as usual. So horrified anxiety is a form of counterfeit compassion. When I'm feeling horrified anxiety, I identify with the suffering of those beings in the front lines of the climate and ecological emergency. I lose perspective, I stiffen and panic. In losing sight of the other beings, I'm no longer able to be of any use to them. The antidote to this is to recognize the anxiety in my heart and my mind, and to see how it prevents me from really empathizing with these beings. What do they really need right now and in the future? And in so doing, being of use to them. By contrast, when I'm ignoring the situation, it's just too scary to contemplate, so I don't. I'd need to be in a very happy and peaceful state of mind in order to be able to contemplate that we're collectively harming the Earth, so I don't. I mean, that's the Earth that nourishes us and sustains us. Usually my mind is repelled by the thought, so I just don't think about it. So learn to recognize both horrified anxiety and ignoring the whole thing, hoping it will go away. Tip number 3, Cultivate genuine compassion, including self-compassion, compassion for yourself. So how do we keep our sense of humanity, our would-be compassionate nature? I believe that at root we're facing a crisis of empathy. We seem to be suffering from a collective crisis of imagination. As a species, we seem to have difficulty getting our heads around the sheer scale of the issues. We seem to have difficulty in visualizing the data. Genuine compassion is a feeling of solidarity with those who are suffering, an awareness of how similar we are to them, combined with an active desire to alleviate that suffering. It means engaging with those beings and what they need to thrive, and springing into action to reduce that suffering. Tip number 4, mourn if you need to. Perhaps what we really need is space to mourn our losses. This is what the philosopher and activist Joanna Macy suggests. She says that until we've done our genuine mourning, we ain't going nowhere with our environmental activism. So perhaps take a moment to reflect. What have you lost in the climate and ecological emergency? What are you afraid of losing? And why is that important? Why is that so precious to you? We all share a love of the earth and a love of life, and it hits hard to know that we're reducing the richness of life and the well-being of future generations. Tip 5. Act to reduce the suffering. Genuine compassion always has the potential for action. However, unless we regularly act to reduce suffering, compassion can easily collapse into pity, sentimentality, or helpless depression. I found that since I've been supporting disruptive non-violent actions and writing the book, even though I know in much more detail the challenges we're facing, I spent less time feeling gloomy or depressed. Sometimes there's genuine mourning. Sometimes there's a kind of wrathful, compassionate anger, but very little depression. What kind of actions will reduce suffering? Well, some will take individual actions like recycling, reducing flights, or moving towards a plant-based diet. Others will take a more systemic approach, like joining with others in Extinction Rebellion or the school strikes to support climate justice. We need both types of action, both types of change. One without the other is very unlikely to be proportionate to the emergency. When you're focused on systemic change, the biggest single shift you can make is to go from being a participant in actions to being an organiser, perhaps inviting your friends to join you in an action. Have a think about it. So here are my 5 tips for staying sane in the climate and ecological emergency. Number 1, recognise that it is an emergency. Number 2, become aware when you get into horrified anxiety or find yourself ignoring it completely and hoping it will go away. Number 3, cultivate genuine compassion, including self-compassion. Number 4, mourn if you need to. And number 5, act to reduce suffering. That's it for now. If you'd like to know more, you can follow the links in the description.